Before I get into the video, small disclaimer, I am a Winnipeg Jets fan, so this video has some degree of bias. On July 5th, 2015, the Hockey News released an article titled Meet Your 2019 Stanley Cup Champs, the Winnipeg Jets, which was written by Ken Campbell. This article was released just after the Winnipeg Jets had made the playoffs for the first time since relocation, and although they were swept by the Anaheim Ducks, there's a lot of optimism surrounding the team. The 2014-2015 Winnipeg Jets had only 7 players over the age of 30, and their key contributors offensively, being Andrew Ladd, Blake Wheeler, Brian Little, and Mark Scheifele and Dustin Byfuglien, were all under 30. And they got key contributions from both Jacob Trouba, Adam Lowry, and the aforementioned Mark Scheifele, who were all 21 years and under. During that season, the Jets also traded away polarizing forward Evander Kane and solid but injury-prone defenseman Zach Bogosian to the Buffalo Sabres for Tyler Myers, Drew Stafford, Joel Armia, Brendan Lemieux, and a first-round pick which turned into Jack Roslovic. This deal improved the Jets greatly in the coming years, as they got a solid young defenseman with a front-loaded contract, a reliable veteran forward, and prospects that would all contribute in the coming years, which will be mentioned later. But perhaps the biggest spot up for optimism was the prospect pool that the team had, as they drafted Nikolai Ehlers in the 2014 draft, Josh Morrissey, who was considered the Jets' top prospect in the 2013 draft, and had drafted Connor Hellebuyck late in the 2012 draft. After their exit in the 2015 playoffs, the 2015 draft was a big step in development for the Winnipeg Jets, as they took both Kyle Connor and Jack Roslovic in the first round. And they continued to add pieces throughout the draft, as they picked Jansen Harkins, Mason Appleton, and Sami Niku late in the draft. While Kyle Connor has become the biggest piece of that draft, all of the players have in some degree played for the Jets, and some were even involved in some pretty big trades in the coming years. Coming off all that momentum of the 2015 playoffs, the 2015-16 season was considered a huge step back, as the Jets finished only 7th in the Central Division, picking up 78 points. However, key prospects cracked the lineup this season, as Nikolai Ehlers played 72 games and had 38 points at 19 years old. Andrew Kopp played 77 games and looked like a great two-way forward that could chip in offensively, and Joel Armia played 42 games. But perhaps the most important of all was Connor Hellebuyck got called up and played very well in 26 games, posting a .918 save percentage and a 2.34 goals against at only 22 years old. While the 2015-16 season was considered a failure, the 2016 draft lottery certainly made up for it. Going into the lottery, the Winnipeg Jets had only a 7.5% chance of receiving the first overall pick. And while the Jets would not end up getting the first pick, they managed to jump up to the second spot, allowing the team to draft the prolific prospect Patrik Laine. The Jets also drafted Logan Stanley at 18th overall in the 2016 draft. However, no other players from this draft class ended up playing more than a few games in the Jets farm system. The 2016-17 season saw small improvement, as the Winnipeg Jets went from 78 points in 2015-16 to 87 points. However, the play looked quite promising, as Patrik Laine had an immediate impact, scoring 36 goals and getting 64 total points in his rookie season. Kyle Connor also made his debut and had flashes, but ultimately had a disappointing 20 games and ended up spending the rest of the season in the AHL. The 2016-17 season also saw a big jump in production with a number of other Jets players, including Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler, as Scheifele led the team with 82 total points and Wheeler was close behind him with 74 points. But most importantly, the two created an apparent chemistry on the first line. Connor Hellebuyck's second season was a small step back, as he had only a 2.89 goals against and a .907 save percentage. And while these numbers really aren't bad in any way, the Jets went into the offseason looking to add a veteran goalie to compete with Hellebuyck for game time, and to act as a sort of 1A, 1B tandem, also wanting to add a little bit more veteran experience in the room. And so, going to that offseason, the Jets made a splash and signed Steve Mason on a 2-year deal at $4.1 million a year. At the time, this looked like a great deal for the Jets, as it would allow for him and Hellebuyck to split time in net. The contract wasn't anything crazy, he had pretty good time in Philadelphia in his last 4.5 seasons. And timeline-wise, this would line up good for when Hellebuck was to hit their peak, or so the Jets thought. That was by far the biggest deal the Jets made that offseason. And while they extended a few contracts, like Brian Little for 6 years at $31 million, Nikolai Ehlers at 7 years, $42 million, the only other big free agent signing was Dmitry Kulikov at 3 years, $13 million. Then came the 2017-18 season, and this was probably the biggest surprise in the league at the time, as the Winnipeg Jets finished second in the NHL with a record of 52, 20, and 10, and 114 points. The only team with more points, ironically, was in their division, as the Nashville Predators finished with 117 points. The Jets had many great performers that year, unsurprisingly, but Wheeler led the team with total points with 91, Laine led the team with 44 goals, and after his demotion last season, Kyle Connor broke out, getting called up and scoring 31 goals, having 26 assists for 57 total points. Steve Mason's tenure with the Jets was disappointing, and it really wasn't his fault, as he battled concussion issues and a knee injury. But Connor Hellebuck had an amazing year, as he posted a 2.36 goals against, a .924 save percentage, and had a career-high 44 wins, but surprisingly didn't win the Vezina that season. But this season, little did we know, was the peak for the Jets, or at least the peak up until the recording of this video in 2023, as the Jets made it to the conference finals that season, but lost to the expansion Las Vegas Golden Knights. The 2018-19 season ended with a first-round exit to the eventual Stanley Cup champion St. Louis Blues, and the Winnipeg Jets have only made it out of the first round since 2017-18, and that was in the 2021 playoffs, where the Jets swept the Oilers before themselves getting swept by the Montreal Canadiens. So I guess all that's left to ask is, what went wrong with the Jets? Well, there really is no one reason, but I guess to start, the Steve Mason contract hurt the Jets quite a bit in the long run, as they looked to trade away his contract after the 2017-18 season. They traded this contract to Montreal, but in order to persuade the Canadiens to take him, they had to throw in Joel Armia to the trade as well. While Joel Armia was never a top 6 guy for the Jets, never really a superstar, and was never going to lead a team in scoring, they lost a two-way forward that was only 25. He played responsible 5-on-5 hockey and was a key penalty killer for the Jets, and they really didn't replace him in the next upcoming years. The early and mysterious retirement from Dustin Byfuglien also hurt the team, and that might end up being a standalone video because there's so many moving parts to that I really can't throw it in this video. But at the time of his retirement in 2018-19, he was the team's top defenseman, was great on the power play, and was one of the most physical players in the league, as his size and speed were unmatched. I also believe while the Jets' youth helped them in 2017-18, it also hurt them, as it was impossible to keep all of their successful draft picks, as Kyle Connor, Patrick Laine, Nick Ehlers, Mark Scheifele, Josh Morrissey, and Connor Hellebuck all needed contracts. As they decided to dole out money to those players, they lost a lot of depth, as Ben Sherratt, Tyler Myers, Brandon Tanev, Andrew Kopp, and so many more were too expensive to keep. I personally don't believe they've ever been able to find the right combo of depth like that again. They've tried many different players. They've traded for Cody Eakin. They've traded for a number of bottom 6 guys, or signed a ton of bottom 6 guys. Tried to move up draft picks like Christian Vesalainen, who they've had in later years, to play in these bottom 6 roles, and they've really never been able to repeat that combo that they had of defense first, aggressive, physical, two-way hockey, and I think that's hurt them a lot. In addition to these expensive contracts that they had to dole out and losing depth, the team's success also hurt, as they often traded away first-round picks for depth, acquiring Paul Stastny twice, Kevin Hayes, Cody Eakin, and others for draft picks, which helped them in the short term, but they hindered the Jets' recent years' development as they've had less picks to work with, and for a team that, for a city that is a less desirable free agent market, it hurts to not be able to develop first rounders or have traded away second, thirds, and fourths in recent drafts. The last problem I will touch on is a problem of keeping some of their top prospects. And it's really only two in particular. The first being Jacob Trouba, who demanded a trade in the 2018-19 season, and the second was Patrik Laine, whose trade seemed more relatively mutual as far as the front office and the player both seeing a benefit than the Trouba deal, but both hurt them. To start, Jacob Trouba was a top pairing defenseman. He's had lots of size, pretty good two-way, maybe not the most offensive, but was defensively sound for the most part. And they really haven't filled that spot. While they got Neil Pionk, and he's been decent for the Jets over the last couple of years, it's been a big drop-off. And Patrik Laine, losing a first-line forward like that, it's tough. And while Patrik Laine hasn't really been able to stay healthy in Columbus and has been a disappointment in Columbus, the Jets have already traded Pierre-Luc Dubois away, the guy who they got back for the deal. And while Dubois had a stretch of good performances in Winnipeg, he was really a little bit disappointing over his full term, and other than a couple good playoff performances, wasn't amazing in the Jets' last playoff run. The Jets still have a decent core, as Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, Nick Ehlers, Josh Morrissey, and now the new captain Adam Lowry are still there. And the acquisition of Iafallo and Velarde have certainly piqued my interest. If this season doesn't go well, I suspect this might be the start of a full rebuild, as both Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck are unrestricted free agents at the end of this season. Meaning, really, if the Jets aren't in a playoff spot by about the trade deadline, I suspect one of, if not both, to be traded. While it's probably going to be tough to trade a goalie mid-season, Mark Scheifele, I think, would for sure be gone. And I think if the Jets hadn't got such a good haul for Dubois, and if they didn't have a couple pieces like Nick Ehlers, Kyle Connor, I think those guys would have been traded this offseason. But who knows? The team might surprise me. Maybe they'll overperform and finish in the upper half or the upper quarter of the league. Realistically, fringe playoffs is probably the most likely outcome for the Jets. But yeah, I'd like to thank you for watching the video. Hope you found it enjoyable, entertaining. There's a couple topics I'd like to go into further depth with, specifically the kind of disappearance of Dustin Byfuglien, the Patrik Laine trade, and maybe even why the Paul Maurice era kind of petered out the way it did. But overall, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. I hope everyone has a good day, and if you enjoyed, maybe consider liking and subscribing. Thank you.